Hello, everyone. I am Mercedes Odegaard, and I had the Uffizi Museum in Florence. And I want to start by apologizing for my pronunciations of pretty much everything in this slideshow. I know for a fact that it's not going to be pronounced right. I tried to look up the pronunciations ahead of time, but there was a lot of them, and I've probably already forgotten how to say a good majority of it, so please bear with me. Okay, starting off, we're going to go right into the history of the Uffizi Museum. So, the Uffizi Museum is one of the first modern museums of our time. In 1560, that is when the building that houses the gallery was actually built. It did not start as a gallery, however, but we'll get into that in the next slide. The gallery has been open to visitors by request since the 16th century, but in 1765, the gallery officially opened to the public. And then in 1865, the gallery formally became a museum. So, some more background here. The building was originally commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici, who was the first Grand Duke of Tuscany. And the building was originally conceived to house the administrative and legal offices of Florence, and it was called the Uffizi, hence the name. And then Francesco I, who was the Grand Duke from 1574 to 1587, was actually the one responsible for creating the first museum arrangement in the gallery, which was on the second floor of the building. And the Uffizi Museum is famous worldwide for its outstanding collections of ancient sculptures and paintings from the Middle Ages to the modern period. So, a majority of this presentation is just going to be touching on kind of like the must-see pieces that the museum houses. So it's obviously a very big building and it's full of a bunch of incredible artwork. But if I went through every single piece it had, we would be here for a few hours. So I just did some research and decided to pick just a few of the ones that seem to be most noticeable, most famous. And these artworks span anywhere from the 13th century to the 20th century. And these are the ones that I just thought we should keep an eye out for when we are actually there. So, starting off, we have the Ognissanti Madonna by Giotto. Again, sorry for the pronunciations. So, this is a large altarpiece that was created in 1310, and a long time ago. And it is a very important landmark in art history. It was originally commissioned for the Florentine Church of Ognissanti, hence the name. And it actually revolutionized painting and the representation of the human figure. Without Giotto, the cultural, philosophical, and artistic movement that we call the Renaissance would never have been born. Although Giotto's perspective was not very scientific, like what would later be developed in the 15th century, the figurative revolution that takes place during the following 100 years after him, known as the Renaissance, is in large part due to him and his work. Next, we have the Annunciation by Simone Martini and Lippo Memmi. This was painted in 1333. Simone Martini and his brother-in-law, Lippo Memmi, were the ones who created this together, and it was commissioned for the altar of Santa Sano in the Cathedral of Siena. And this painting actually is one of the greatest examples of Sienese Gothic painting, characterized by the wonderful elegance of both line and color. The painting is fully Sienese for the beauty and the gentleness of the lines and the color, which was actually in opposition to the Florentine style, which was more related to the volume and the shape of the painting. And next, we have the Adoration of the Magi by Gentile da Fabriano. This painting was also called Palostrozzi. It was painted in 1423. It was commissioned by a wealthy banker and intellectual, Paolo Strozzi, for the family chapel in the Church of Santa Trinita. Um, this is a really good example of international Gothic style. It's considered one of the great masterpieces of that style. It's very elegant and it has a fairy tale atmosphere, and the figures are in very sophisticated poses, which is a staple of the international Gothic style. Next, we have the portraits of the Duke and Duchess of Urbino by Piero della Francesca. I found this one to be very interesting. So, this is one of the most famous works of art of the Italian Renaissance. It depicts the Duke Federigo da Montefeltro and his wife Battista Sforza. The double profile portraits are reminiscent of the classical portrait medals, and it gives a very um, ancient point of view to the two figures. And these actually are painted on the back as well. These are front and back paintings. On the back, it's the Duke going into battle and his wife sitting by his side. This was created in between 1465 and 1472. And it is very reminiscent of a Renaissance man. So choosing the representation in profile was also an inescapable choice. It's kind of funny. The Duke had actually lost his right eye during a tournament, and for this reason, only the left side of his face is portrayed. So that was actually on purpose. His nose was also broken in the tournament, so he chose to have his good side displayed, if you will. And the artist, actually, with his rational and almost metaphysical style, he achieves the perfect representation of the Renaissance man, aware of the centrality of his role in the universe and the importance of his intelligence and his culture. Next, we have the Battle of San Romano, probably, by Paolo Uccello. This is actually a part of a larger collection. It's just a central panel. The other two are actually in different galleries. It was painted approximately in 1438, and it has been dispersed and divided between the Uffizi, the National Gallery in London, and the Louvre in Paris. It was commissioned by the Bartolini family, and what makes this cycle a masterpiece is the bold and experimental use of the perspective, which made Uccello famous. The actual painting itself depicts the unhorsing of Bernardino della Chiarda, who was the leader of the Sienese mercenaries. The naturalistic details, the hunting scenes in the background, the finicky description of the armors and the horses remind us of the fairy tale Gothic aesthetics. Uccello is indeed an important transition artist, fully in love with the Renaissance Revolution, but winking at the Gothic tradition. So it's a mix of both here. Next, we have the Santa Lucia de Magnoli altarpiece by Veneziano. This was painted between 1445 and 1447. It was commissioned to be on the main altar of Santa Lucia de Magnoli Church in Via de' Bardi, and it originally had a beautiful predella underneath, but this one was also divided, and the other pieces can be seen in Washington, Cambridge, and Berlin museums. This piece of artwork is also known as the Sacred Conversation, and it is probably the first and oldest altarpiece with a rectangular form and without a gold background, which was typical of the Gothic style at the time. The most innovative element is the usage of light. In fact, light is fundamental and reaches the whole scene, coming in from the top right corner. The architectural space in the painting is harmonious and depicted following the modern principles of geometric perspective, which was enhanced by the inlaid marble. This painting is also characterized by its luminous light and bright colors, and those also strongly affected the work of Piero della Francesca, who we talked about earlier. Now we have Madonna with Child and Two Angels. This one's by Filippo Lippi. It was painted around 1465. This is one of Lippi's best known and most admired pieces of work of the Renaissance. Um, the the woman is a true model of elegance in this work, and the sweetness of the composition, as well as the gracefulness of the veils and the woman's hairdressing, would later become a model of elegance for many painters, such as Botticelli, who we've also talked about. So this was a big inspiration piece for lots of people. Next, we have the La Primavera. This one is very famous. I'm sure lots of people know it already, by Botticelli, who we just touched on. This is also known as the allegory of spring, and it is full of allegorical meanings. And the interpretation is difficult and still uncertain. It's still debated over. It was painted for Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici. And among the theories proposed over the last few decades, the ones that seem to be the most corroborated is the interpretation of the painting as the realm of Venus, sung by the ancient poets and by Polizano, who was a famous scholar at the court of Medici. So, the allegory of spring is a very refined work of art. The naturalistic details of the meadow, the skillful use of the color, the elegance of the figures, and the poetry of the whole have made this important and fascinating work celebrated all over the world. It also can be interpreted as humanistic. So, an explanation of that would be Venus is the goodwill, as she distinguishes the material, which is on the right, from the spiritual values on the left. The Humanatus promotes the ideal of a positive man, confident in his abilities and sensitive to the needs of others. Next, we have The Birth of Venus, another really famous one, also by Botticelli. This would be considered one of Botticelli's most famous and appreciated works. It was created between 1482 and 1485, and it is considered to be a landmark of Italian painting. It is definitely one of the most famous, most appreciated. It is very rich in meaning and allegorical references. The theme for the painting comes from Ovid's Metamorphoses, which was a very important part of Latin literature. And the Medici, which we've been talking about a lot, was the family that commissioned The Birth of Venus, including the works Pallas and the Centaur and the Allegory of Spring. And they all belonged to Lorenzo, who we mentioned earlier. And this painting is actually the first example in Tuscany of a painting on canvas, which is a pretty big deal. And the special use of expensive alabaster powder made the colors even brighter and timeless, another unique characteristic of his work. Next, we have Doni Tondo by Michelangelo, who I'm sure we all have heard of. This was created between 1506 and 1508. This is another really good example of the staple of Italian art. It was originally commissioned by Agnolo Doni. This piece of art is actually the only painting by Michelangelo in Florence and is, like we said, considered one of the greatest of that time. The figures of Mary, Joseph, and the Child are grouped in a single volume in which the rotation of the Madonna gives the composition a spiral movement that will later be used by many artists afterwards. This piece of work is a very important work of art because it is one of the few examples of Michelangelo's painting. So, now we have Madonna of the Goldfinch by Raphael. A nickname for Raphael was actually Raphael the Divine. This represents a very distinctive aesthetic. Raphael accepts the approach of the pyramidal composition, the gentle effects of the soft light, and the emotional dialogue between the characters, revealing the elements peculiar to the painting of Leonardo. Raphael's own personal style included a sweetness of the faces, and a masterful use of colors, as well as a realistic reproduction of the landscape and a profound intimacy between the figures. This painting actually ended up being severely damaged because of the collapse of a building where it was being housed. It suffered serious damage with deep, long gashes that had defaced the wooden panel. So it has endured many restorations over the years. But it was only thanks to the last restoration, which was accomplished in 2008, that the work was returned to its original splendor. Next, we have the Venus of Urbino by Titian. This was painted in 1538. It was commissioned by the Duke of Urbino, Guidobaldo II della Rovere, and it is actually full of hidden meanings, which is very interesting. So, the painting was actually a gift from the Duke to his young wife, and the painting represents the allegory of marriage and was a teaching model to Julia Veriano, the young wife, of eroticism, fidelity, and motherhood. The evident eroticism of the painting reminded the woman of the marital obligations she would have to fill to her husband. The erotic allegory is evident in the representation of Venus, the goddess of love, as a sensual and delectable woman staring at the viewer who could not ignore her beauty. The light and warm color of her body is in contrast to the dark background, bringing out her eroticism. The strong sensuality of this painting was therefore consistent with its private domestic purpose as a gift from husband to wife. Thanks to the wise use of color and its contrast, as well as the subtle meanings and allusions, Titian achieves the goal of representing the perfect Renaissance woman, who, just like Venus, becomes a symbol of love, beauty, and fertility. Again, sorry about the pronunciations. We're working on it. Okay, next we have Bacchus by Caravaggio. This is one of the most important artists in the history of art. His full name was Michelangelo Merisi, also called Caravaggio. He was nervous by temperament, often violent, revolutionary in his way of painting. Caravaggio personifies in every aspect of his eventful life the romantic figure of the damned artist. This painting was commissioned by his patron Cardinal del Monte as a gift for the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Ferdinand I, and it was painted between 1596 and 1597. Although this is a masterpiece, the main character of the piece is not represented in the usually idealized way. On the contrary, he might look like a man of the people, like one of those characters Caravaggio used to hang around with in taverns and brothels. As in the majority of his paintings, however, the landscape is missing. He really wanted to focus on the humanity of the character rather than the details around him. His choice of representing popular, uncouth, and clumsy subjects brought him much criticism during his life. However, he's very famous now. He actually used a complex system of mirrors to paint the subjects on a canvas, just like a primitive photographic technique. His outstanding use of the oil technique also is what made him famous. The effects of incredible realism in painting the fruit basket and the complexion of the young man, as well as the transparency of the glass, created a new approach to art. Caravaggio was unconventional, introspective, and a real rebel. He focused on the human beings, describing the imperfections and limitations of his mortal nature. His way of painting forever upset the course of history and art. The last painting we have is Judith and Holofernes by Artemisia Gentileschi. She was actually one of the only famous woman painters of the 17th century. She was an Italian painter, considered one of the most accomplished women painters of the time. In an era where female painters were not easily accepted, she was the first female painter to become a member of the Accademia di Arte del Disegno in Florence. However, due to the violent nature of her work, it was often confined to a dark corner in the Pitti Palace, and only after Cosimo II's death was Artemisia even paid for her work, with the help and mediation of her friend Galileo. While the Uffizi Museum is home to many, many, many wonderful paintings. It does also house some sculptures. So this picture shows an example of one part of the museum that houses some sculptures. And they are the invaluable collection of ancient statues and busts from the Medici family. Like we've talked about the Medici family a lot in this presentation. They are a big part of the Uffizi Museum. And it was thanks to them that we have so many works of art to look at. And here are my sources. Went a little long, sorry about that. Thanks for sticking with me through my horrible pronunciations. And yeah, thanks for watching.